Hello and welcome to the waiting list, the podcast where we delve into all things. I hate the phrase mental health, but mental health, the professionals that work in it, and dedicate their lives to help others. And today I have the pleasure to introduce my friend. I'd like to say now, Emmanuel Steels, if I'm saying that right. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Just a bit about Emmanuel. He is a clinical psychologist with a wealth of experience working in various clinical settings internationally and in the UK. He has worked well over a decade in the NHS and in the private sector and honed his experience by working with the clients facing moderate to severe mental health challenges. As a core member of the I'm struggling to pronounce this one. As a core member of multidisciplinary teams and working alongside exemplary colleagues, Emmanuel has gained invaluable experience in the clinical field. He has recently launched a company, the Reinhardt Group, which aims to revolutionising corporate well-being. Hopefully, today, Emmanuel will share his insights and experiences, shedding light on the complexities of mental health and the path to healing. So sit back, relax, and prepare for an enlightening, I hope, conversation on the waiting list. And just before we start as well, we want to say thank you to the RTF, which is the Royal Theatrical Fund, who help all sorts of professionals, mainly actors, and you can hear them talking outside. In the entertainment industry, whether you've been injured or can't work for any reason, please reach out to them. They're very, very good. There you go. Shall we get started?
Yeah, sure.
So we're doing this more as an introduction, just for people listening.
Mm.
Do you want to go to kind of tell people how we got to this point, and then I can add in anything, as you're the professional here and I'm the idiot.
Well, as you stated, I'm a clinical psychologist and have been working in the NHS and in the private sector well over a decade, accumulated a lot of hands-on experience. And the one thing that I know for sure is that at any given moment, there are millions of people waiting on some sort of a waiting list to access mental health support. Equally, there are millions of people who simply can't afford private support. So they're dependent on the resources available through charities, local initiatives, and the NHS. And as we all know, there is a massive gap between the resources available and the demand. And then obviously you come and you bring a lived experience of mental health difficulties. And you contacted me thinking it would be a good mix, a good match to have you represent what is commonly referred to as the service user.
Or the audience in this case.
Or the audience in this case, indeed. And then me bringing my clinical knowledge and experience. And we hopefully will have guests come into the podcast so that we can broaden the scope of what we delve in, the topics. And the aim is to help people understand mental health in general, but in a way that doesn't use a lot of jargon, that isn't overly scientific, basically in layman's terms, so that it's accessible to all. And then secondly, hopefully that the knowledge that we share in the podcast may be used to the benefit of those who may have questions either about their own mental health difficulties and how to address these, or maybe how to understand them in the first place, or if not for themselves, it could be loved ones or people that they're acquainted with.
Exactly. And I think just to kind of preface, even though I don't like the word mental health, I just think it's a bit of a weird phrase, and it always makes me feel a bit weird whenever people say it. I've got OCD, which is something that's been an ongoing thing for the past kind of 7 years. Just so people kind of know. I'm sure my friends listening to this are kind of saying, "Oh, he's banging on about it again" or something. You know, it's not the kind of worst thing in the world, but in terms, I think the name, the waiting list. I know you've just said it's about waiting lists for people to get on, but personally, I've got family members who haven't been able to get into, haven't been able to afford to go to private therapy, and you know, you have one session with the I think it's the Samaritans or with in an NHS kind of consultation room, and you know, you can't see them again for another year. And I think with, you know, the growth of people like Andrew Huberman and people like that is really great, and people seem to have like an appetite for it. But even when I listen to Andrew Huberman, sometimes it's just too wordy. There's too much to it, and I know there's certain things he says, and people go, right, I can do this and do this. But I thought it would be really interesting having an actual psychologist, you know, kind of go through those issues. So, I mean, my idea was, and obviously we've spoken about this, but for the audience, my idea was to essentially come to you as the audience would, and eventually, you know, we'll put out questions or things like that with specific issues. That if you were in a, you know, uh, psychology setting with a client, how you would kind of walk them through it. Of course, you're never going to get the same experience that you would from therapy, but there may be certain things that you can pick up on, you know, as the audience, and we're going to do very specific things. You know, obviously, our first episode is going to be on OCD because it's something I understand and going to know very well, and then after that, I kind of want to delve into as much as we can, and you know, to very specific kind of things, and broad, you know, wider range things as well, because people say, "Oh, I've got anxiety," and I kind of go, "Okay, mine is so specific. I know exactly what it is, why I'm having it." It's like just, and some people just are nervous or scared, or so. Yeah, I think it's very interesting for people to listen to. That's what I'd say anyway.
Well, hopefully, and yeah,
Or not.
I'm all in, and obviously we'll, you know, I guess the format will grow as we gain experience, exposure, and people interact with us. But the aim, as you said, is very much to be dynamic, to, you know, be able to cater to the audience's questions, and I hope I'll do a good job at simplifying this maybe mystique that tends to hang around. You know, mental health provisions and therapy, and you know, it can feel, you know, as a maze when trying to, well, find support in the first place. Right?
Yeah, I think. I mean, first of all, with you, I've seen various therapists, but the thing that I've noticed from, you know, knowing you is that you're not a typical therapist from when you'd meet people. You know, there's a kind of psychologist near me that I used to see, and I occasionally see her walking our dog or whatever, and very much there's a different kind of mentality. They're almost reserved, pulled back, and I think that's the opinion most people have. Like the stereotypical, it's like, you know, someone with their glasses down like this and they're looking at their clipboard or whatever, and you know, they don't really say much, and I feel like people get quite unnerved by that. But you know, I find you extremely interesting, and that's why I thought you'd be great, you know, to do this. Is that, you know, you're extremely active. You've got your own opinions, and you're not afraid to kind of say them, but you let people know that they can have their own opinions as well. And you've got, you know, a family which you're very open about, and you're not. I feel like a lot of these other psychologists and people that work in the field are very cut off. They sever themselves, and I feel like that could be at the detriment to a lot of their relationships with clients, because clients sometimes don't. I feel like you have to be open with someone to trust someone. Like, you know, you have to kind of open yourselves up, and I feel like that's probably puts people off it quite a lot, because they feel like they're being, I don't know if interrogated's the word, but I'm sure your clients would be very happy to go for a drink with you, or not. They might absolutely hate you. I don't know. I don't think they would hate you, because you've got a lot of clients and seem to do, you know, very well from it. But Yeah, I think that's kind of the mystique behind it. Um, and I think I don't really know what else to add to that kind of intro of ourselves.
Okay. Maybe just sharing my perspective on this last part that you've spoken about. So I think there's a um, categorization. No,
Yeah.
no, not categorization.
Or not.
Characterization. That's the
Ah.
word. Characterization that happens. Indeed, the way you described it. If you were to see it played in a Netflix show or a movie, there may be that kind of distant persona being displayed as the um, but let's not forget this is also what is taught to therapists. It has a therapeutic use. Yeah, so this kind of use of self, how much you diverge in a session or to your clients over time, how much of you bring in that session, that really depends on the relationship between the client and the therapist. So the therapist, a therapist, or even myself, you know, may at times be more open if I think it's relevant and it could be of use to the client. I would say, oh, by the way, I'm also a dad of 3 kids, because I know it helps to create rapport with a client who may otherwise think, what do you know about? But it's less the case now. But when I was younger, it happened that people mistook my age and thought I was a bit younger than I was, and I understand. It's fully understandable that if you're a mom or a dad and you're struggling the demands of work and personal life, you don't it's more difficult to create a rapport with, say, 19-year-old Emmanuel, who has no clue basically except from literature and studies, than having someone who has lived experience of that. On the flip side, there's a danger to that, because you need to then, as a therapist, be aware that you're not listening to the client's story through your own bias, through your own lived experience, and say, oh yeah, I know how that feels for you because this is how it felt.
So you're saying when you're younger, you're more of a blank slate.
Yeah, and so this blank slate, again, it is a therapeutic tool. We speak of transference and countertransference, and us being indeed this blank slate on which the client can project their emotions. So that's one thing. Why therapists, including myself, we do that, and then secondly is but personalities matter. That's just a reality. This is my opinion, but I tend to say to my clients, listen, pretty much half of the story will depend on whether you and I can form a good therapeutic relationship, whether you feel that you can trust me, whether you feel I can get you. And this getting is, yes, it's emotional, but it's also intellectual, it's also cultural, it can be philosophical. You need that kind of richness of, in the dynamic between
And
clients.
I've had that with, I think that's because I've got friends, family, whoever, who have been into, and I don't think therapy is for everyone. I'm not saying that everyone should, you don't have to. I'm just saying in specific, in my instance, I definitely needed to. And I've had, 7 different people I've seen, and I'd like to say that I kind of know straight away when someone's not for me, because it's, I seem to have done, but just on paper, I seem to have done better when it's a male therapist over a female therapist. I don't know what that is or why that is. General kind of things like that, very basic things that seem, and I think people, go once and go, oh, I didn't like that, that was weird. And I got lucky on my first time and had someone really, really good. But other people don't really.
Yeah.
And I think they go, oh, I'm not doing that, that was a waste of time. And again, I've tried loads of different forms of therapy as well, whether it be hypnotherapy, exposure therapy or CBT, which I think are kind of linked in the same one. And then there's like general counselling as well, which isn't really therapy, but it kind of is. There's like a whole kind of thing going on there. And some people say one works great, the other doesn't. It's such like a balance between I think it's just finding the right one for you. I think that's the most important thing. And some people get very unlucky to start with.
Yeah, it's not a case of good or bad. I don't think I'm being politically correct by saying that. I think it's not about being a good therapist or a bad therapist, or a good client or bad client. It is about the dynamic, the relationship between both, and what works for one may not work for another. So again, as an experienced therapist, you don't tend to have a one-size-fits-all. You won't have the same rapport with every single client. You won't use the same modalities. I mean, there's a lot of factors that come into play.
As a clinical psychologist, therapist,
Yeah.
ever had a client where you've gone, no, like this relationship isn't going to work? Just because, not because of anything like kind of negative, but just because you're not gelling, and it's they're just wasting their money, and I feel like that's quite an important thing for people to know as well, that other therapists should be able to kind of go, no, this isn't working. But I can recommend someone for you.
Yeah, sure. I've had clients. And again, not on the level of the personality, but it could be that it requires a certain type of specialism that I think that's not really,
what you specialize in.
What I specialize in. Or I don't, I haven't worked in an inpatient setting dealing with these types of presentation, and therefore to do this on an outpatient basis, meaning that the client still, lives home and goes to work, or maybe is signed off work, but comes and sees you regularly, may or may not have a psychiatrist involved in the care. It happens. I mean, recently there was this young boy, lovely young boy, 12 years old. He is ASC, ASD, so autistic spectrum disorder or autistic spectrum condition. It's the same thing, but in general, we try to, or the whole, say, therapeutic community tries to steer away from labeling mental health presentations as disorders or even issues.
Because it's diseases. A negative.
Yeah, so now obviously we try and refer to mental health conditions, rather than the other terms. So also in the picture was a comorbidity with ADHD, so attention deficit hyperactivity disorder.
What do you mean comorbidity with?
Comorbidity, thanks. That is when two different presentations, two different diagnoses, if you want, kind of come together. There's an overlap. The one, it could be that you have a first one that causes another one.
So like, I'm just using me as an example.
Yeah.
OCD and then depression.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So, or anxiety-based presentations. If you're anxious, if you feel anxious for a long time, it won't take that long for it to have a negative impact on your mood. Why? Because most of what you think about revolves around the negativity, the fear, what could go wrong. Yeah. And then you're just less in touch with the beauty of life, the things that have meaning, that uplift you. Yeah. And so, it's very common that you have anxiety as a primary condition, and then secondary to that is, depression. So that's a comorbidity. But some conditions just have an overlap and tend to come together. And so obviously autism, ASD, ASC, and ADHD, they're both neurodevelopmental conditions. There is an overlap there. So we know that you have a higher prevalence or a higher tendency to have the one if you have the other. Yeah.
Okay. I forgot what my original question was. When you say you specialise in certain things, I won't ask what those things are because I feel like then it limits us to what we're going to talk about. But I'm guessing you learn everything, and then there's certain
I
things
need
that
to
you
interrupt you.
what.
I know what question we were trying to answer. It was about the clients, yeah. And I was trying to come up with a case example.
Oh, the boy.
Yeah, the boy.
The boy. Sorry,
So
went off.
I'll just, and I know I tend to veer off. I can talk for hours
Yeah,
about
Emmanuel
these
just
things.
rambles on.
So just give me a sign if I just lose myself. Yeah. So this boy basically, after 2 sessions, I said to his mum, I think that the relationship I'm establishing with him is much more, coaching, but I'm not sure that I'm getting through to him, and I didn't want her to spend a significant amount. There is a financial commitment when you engage in private therapy, and I thought that seemingly what I have on offer for this young boy, who whose perspective slightly differed from mine, which is important to note. But
Can I ask what you mean by perspective different?
so his felt experience. So he his mum.
I know you've got to be careful about what you say.
No, it's fine. I mean, it's just anonymous. But his mum said to me that he'd come out of a session. I think the first time we met, and he said to his mum, "God, therapy isn't for everyone." And the experience in the room was of a boy who answered pretty much every question I asked him with, "I don't know, I don't know." So it was particularly difficult to, to get through my assessment and get something of substance to use. Anyway, in this example, I thought, yeah, we could keep on seeing each other, but although I have worked with tons of teenagers and children who had neurodevelopmental conditions, I thought it wasn't money well spent for mum. There were complexities in the family dynamic as well, which to me played a bigger impact, or played a bigger role in his difficulties than these single individual diagnoses. So yes, you had that neurodevelopmental. You had there was some dyspraxia there as well. Again, it's another diagnosis, but his father, which ultimately was to me the real crux of the story, unfortunately struggled with bipolar disorder, and this young boy seemingly responded to what was going on in his context, and that to me was the story that needed to be addressed way more than offering him the support. Why? Because I didn't want him to develop a sense that he was a problem that needed to be fixed when he was courageous enough to come and seek support. Yet a factor that in my mind played a bigger impact, or played a bigger role in kind of impacting his mood and his demeanor, his behavior, wasn't being addressed. Why? Because father wasn't very keen or willing to consider engaging in therapeutic support for understandable reasons, and there's a history there. But so yeah, that's a situation where after 2-3 sessions, I said,
Yes.
I don't think it's of benefit to continue seeing your son. To the contrary, maybe we will start eroding the trust and the belief he may have that therapy can be useful. Why? Because if contextually nothing changes,
Then
and an individual comes to therapy, you will not see the changes. So simply put, if you're living in an abusive or toxic relationship, and one of the partners engages in therapeutic support, but every day goes back to that abusive partner, then you're not going to bring about a lot of change. It would be counterproductive to do so, because the person taking ownership of engaging in therapy may be kind of burdening themselves with the belief that they are at fault. They need to work on some issues, has been said to them, and then you'll see a change, a positive change, and because that doesn't happen, because
then therapy to them is useless.
Yeah. So that's just one of the many cases I can think of where it's just not. It's not helpful to provide therapeutic support. Context being a major one.
I'm conscious we've got to wrap up. do you, kind of last question, just based on that, do you think a lot of those kind of problems come from childhood? And because this is, I think, a topic people do speak about a lot, is whether it's something that's happened to you um, throughout life, after childhood, because it seems to be when a lot of things manifest, or could it be from childhood? I know this is a very deep question for a last question because it goes into genetics, DNA. I mean, I know for me personally, I'd like to say I know. I think there's a very clear link between my family, my father, and then with me, my parents. That it all kind of comes into one, plus my own experiences to create this kind of monster. But would you agree that it's mostly from childhood experiences or genetics?
Okay, so I want to answer this question to the best of my abilities. It's a key question for anyone who has any interest in mental health difficulties. So it starts with the understanding that you have a genetic predisposition, or you can have a genetic predisposition to developing certain mental health difficulties. But it's more complex than that. So when it comes to genes and genetic predisposition, it's a complex interplay between your genome, your genes, and environmental and psychological factors, meaning that your genes provide the blueprint. You could say the recipe. I'll try and make an analogy with
At the building
cooking.
blocks.
Yeah. So your genome or your genes provide a blueprint of what could develop. But it's not because you have certain genes that automatically you will develop a condition. So what needs to come together is it's a multitude of genes. Okay, we speak of polygenetic nature of these conditions. Poly meaning
You're losing me here. Yeah.
Well, so when you look at genes, for most conditions, it's tens or sometimes hundreds of different genes that play a role in the potential development of a condition.
And there's the main thing, potential. It
Okay.
never is 100%.
All right, stay with me, yeah. But let me know when you let me know if
I got
if
an E in
lose it, okay?
biology. I couldn't even do biology.
So you have a but I'll tell you an analogy with a recipe book and a chef that cooks a recipe, which should really kind of help you to understand the overall story. So polygenic nature of conditions, so multitude of genes, not just the one gene. It's not a question of that is the case for some conditions, but it's a minority. It's a tiny minority of conditions that depend on simply one gene being present and being expressed. So that's it's Mendel. So it's Mendelian gene expression. I guess that's the best way. So Mendel basically developed this framework for us to understand how certain conditions really depend on just one gene. Yeah. Examples of that is Huntington's disease, Fragile X syndrome, Rett's syndrome. So just conditions that either
Very
are
specific.
neurodegenerative, so meaning that your cognitive capacity and more just also your ability to regulate your emotions, etc., that starts to degenerate. Or some conditions are neurodevelopmental, so you're born with the disorder. So that's a minority. So on the other side, you have this polygenic, so a multitude of genes that can lead to the development of a condition. But what else is necessary? That is that you have an interplay between these genes and a history, a story. Yeah, and that's the environmental factors. And what are these environmental factors? Well, usually that is exposure to negative inputs at crucial times of brain development. So that is
Parents.
that it starts during pregnancy. Yeah. So drug use during pregnancy, high levels of stress during pregnancy. So, for example, a woman who is pregnant and is being abused, or living in very precarious financial situation, lots of stress, uncertainty.
But would it even have to be down to something that, you say financial being abused? Could it just be, it's someone who's pregnant being just predisposed themselves to anxiety and being a high stress individual?
Yeah. So yes, for sure. So that's how it kind of works. So you have the environment that needs to trigger the gene. So we then speak of gene expression. So gene expression basically means that you can have, say, a gene, and if it is activated through external inputs, then it will start to produce a protein. Yeah, and then there's a cascading effect of that. So again, multitude of genes, the interplay with environmental factors. What kind of factors help us understand, on the level of genetics, whether yes or no a certain condition is developed? Well, you have the variants. Yeah, so that can be a variation in DNA sequencing. For example, SNP, single nucleus polymorphism.
You're using big words.
Yeah. All right. Okay. So basically, there's that, or the copy of the gene. So the number of copies of a of a certain gene that happens or doesn't happen. So basically, so you have the variants. Yeah. And then you have epigenetics. Epigenetics simply means either the condition happens and it turns on a gene, or it doesn't and the gene stays silent, or vice versa. You can shut off a certain gene through external factors. Yeah. Again, that can be a multitude of things. So chronic stress, diet, substance use and substance misuse, lifestyle choices, and so on. All of that. And that's what you're looking at. So let me explain it with an analogy. Imagine that your genome, the whole of possibilities that could be expressed over time, is contained in a recipe book. Yeah, and that recipe book has been handed down from your parents to you. Here you are, Sam. These are all the good and the bad stuff that may or may not happen to you. Okay, that's a recipe. That's a genome. Okay, you flip through the book, or the chef flips through the book, chooses a specific recipe. So these are the genes. Yeah. So choose a specific recipe. Now it's a special recipe, particularly complex. Let's say bipolar, for example. Now I choose bipolar because bipolar, we know that the hereditary load of that is very high. It's 70 to 80%. Yeah? So whether you will or will not have the condition depends for 70 to 80% if, let's say, you have a parent that has that condition. So you have the ingredients, but then the chef, let's say, it's a hot and sunny day, so the chef will be more inclined to make a salad rather than a stew. If it was, let's say, it was a cold and blustery day, the chef would go for, okay, I'll make a stew.
Sausage and mash.
Sausage and mash, good example, yeah. And then the ingredients, these are the variants I spoke to you of earlier on, meaning you can do the recipe using white sugar, or you can do the recipe using brown sugar. It's the same recipe with a small variant, of small variants, but yet the outcome will be different. Yeah, and so that's when you get into the realm of, how to put it simply, when DNA basically is being copied or multiplies in a wrong way. Yeah. Whether it's the sequencing of the DNA itself, or whether it is the number of copies of that is being produced, that's the variance. It's a big reason as to why you get different outcomes. Yeah. Then of course I spoke about this on and off gene. So this on and off gene, that's the environmental factors. Like, what have you been exposed to in your life? And I would say, arguably, mostly during your childhood. That is true. Yeah. So we just know that.
Parents, school, friends.
Yeah, but the first 4 to 7 years have a big impact on how how you will feel, act, behave in later life. Yeah, you can rewire that. It's not because you've had trauma in your life that automatically this is going to be the rest of your life, but that's inevitably very key stage of brain development. We also know that in the first 4 years of a child's development, it's mainly the right hemisphere that is active
of the brain,
and the limbic system, and that is something that doesn't really require words. That's just a felt sense of being loved. Yeah, like if a child cries and you hold that child in your hands, there's no point talking to the child, asking what's wrong. It can't speak. Yeah, it doesn't understand language yet, but it can feel. It can feel, the warmth of your skin. It can feel your heartbeat. It can feel, and that's just an intuitive, almost sixth sense that helps to regulate the baby's emotions. And then as a dad or a mum, you absorb that. Yeah, the child's just crying. It wants something. It's either uncomfortable, it's hungry, or it needs to poo or whatnot. And you just hold it and you absorb these emotions. You process it, and then you kind of hand it back to the child in a processed way. And it's a very important process for children to go through. Spiritual, yeah, for sure. It's love. That's what it comes down to, yeah. And we know that when things interact with that process, especially in the first 4 years, you have a higher prevalence of addiction. So trauma, not necessarily so, not with all types of addictions. But going back to the recipe book, so the chef, this on and off, you could say are the environmental factors, and that could be the time of year. Maybe certain ingredients aren't available. Yeah, it's let's say it's winter time, and the chef wants to cook with stuff that is available around the restaurant or is locally produced and so on. And that's how you can. And so if you keep in mind all of these different factors, you get to a different recipe altogether. So simply put, there is a genetic load in most mental health conditions. So OCD, you could say between 45 and 65%. Yeah.
Is that the actual numbers?
Yeah. So again, more or less, the hereditary factor, but it's not the only factor. As I said, is multifactorial. It's not, again, nor is it just one gene. It's a multitude of genes. And then it's not a given that because you have these genes that they are going to be expressed. There needs to be a catalyst in order for these genes to become expressed. And then even then, having only a genetic load may be acted by having just the right kind of nurturing environment, yeah, where there isn't trauma, where there isn't neglect, where there is no substance misuse, and you do not have prolonged periods of chronic stress. You have a good diet, and that may be sufficient. Having that right type of nurture can be sufficient to keep this genetic predisposition at bay because it's not activated. Yeah? So I hope I made sense.
We'll have to listen back to it.
Yeah. Maybe I want to summarize that, but maybe just this, all right? Apologies if it's a bit lengthy. When it comes to when it comes to genetic predisposition, we speak of a complex interplay of a multitude of genes that interact with environmental and psychological factors. Yeah. So that's basically how you summarize it. And so yes, when it comes to genetic load, as you said, it does. Most anxiety, OCD, phobias, all of that travels in the family. Yeah. But as you know, it is not because your dad or your grandmother or anyone else, for that matter, had a certain condition, that therefore you will automatically develop it yourself. But you do have propensity? You do have a higher likelihood to develop it. Okay. Then there's also learned behavior. Yeah. During your childhood, children are like sponges. They look around. So forget genetic load. If you're
just exposed to it.
If your first degree relative, say your dad or your mum, is phobic, you inevitably have a higher likelihood, whether there is genetic load or not, to also incorporate that phobia. Why? Because it is the response to a trigger that is learned. So if your mum or your dad kind of loses it, at the sight of a tiny tspider, as a child, that scenario will just fill you with dread and fear, and that's how the phobia.
That is so. Sorry, we do also have my brother here as well, who's helping us produce this. But my mum is frightened of spiders, and me and him will chase her around. We will put it in a glass and just run after her with it. Yeah, I think you threw a cockroach at her. See, that's not nice. She freaked out, but that's one thing that hasn't passed to us. But then if you look at, Dad, his fear of getting ill, that seems to pass to me. Or I don't know if it's passed to me, but not him. So it's very interesting how it can kind of miss people or just never happen. It almost feels random. Well, it is random. Is it random? Yeah.
Yeah. No.
Yeah, there's so much to that. Wow. Anything else you want to note before we? Because I feel like this will be a good entrance into our next episode.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah. Apologies if I was a bit lengthy with the genetic
your recipe
predisposition, but I think if you don't get that, you shouldn't do any psychology, because it's the foundation to understand. It's also the blueprint to understand. Like, you look at family history, you look why, because you want to know, is there a genetic predisposition?
Yeah, I think it's, I don't know, the thing I went through personally as well is you almost want to blame, so you want to blame someone.
Okay.
And just personally, I found that it was kind of like, oh, mum and dad, mum's a worrier, dad's a hypochondriac, this is their fault that I'm like this. And you have to get over that pretty quickly. But I think we can talk about that in the next episode, where we're going to talk about...
Yeah, just quickly, that's called... there's many things that come into play, but that's mainly called external locus of control. We all have that, yeah. And
where you want to blame...
Where basically bad stuff that happens to you in life, the reason's somewhere else, yeah.
Right.
You have that scene in Rocky where Rocky
Never
speaks.
seen it.
No, Creed.
Never. Well, I've seen the first one.
Well, obviously, Rocky Balboa speaks to his protege and is like, you go on blaming everyone else, around you, but that's not life. That's not who you are. And then he says it's not about how many times
you get hit.
Yeah, well, that external locus of control is something very important to be aware of and work with, because ownership of the good and the bad in life will help to bring about positive change.
Extreme ownership, Jocko Willink.
It doesn't need to be extreme. Yeah, there's a there's a downside to everything. There's always two sides of a coin to any proposed kind of solution or predicament or situation or experience. It doesn't need to be extreme. But yeah.
Great. Well, thank you for listening, and we will see you on the next episode.
All right.
Like and subscribe. Peace.